Yo, what's up everyone? This video we're going to be talking a little bit more about variables and how to work with them, specifically assignment, initialization, all that good stuff. Alright, let's get started. So we have been working with variables and we're understanding the basics for the most part, but now I just want to go a little bit more in depth on how we create variables and just the different options. So I'm just going to clear out all this junk. Okay, so we can create a variable like this in x equals 5. We just created a primitive type variable because it's of type int, and there's 8 primitives. We talked about those in the previous video. Well, this is actually a 2-step process, and we're just doing them both at once. So here's how we create a variable. Step 1 is we declare a variable, and then step 2 is initialize a variable. So when we do this, we're actually doing both at once, but we could break this out into 2 steps, and that's what we're going to do now. So if I go in here and I said int x and just put a semicolon, that would be one statement, and then we would say x equals 5. That would be a second statement. So yeah, that's all I got for you guys. No, I'm just kidding. We're gonna go in a little bit more depth. So why would you ever want to do this? Why would you declare a variable on one line and then initialize it on the other? Well, you might be in the situation where you're thinking and saying, oh, I really need this variable x, but I don't exactly know what the value is going to be right now. So what we're going to do is we're just going to declare it up here, and then later on when we get the value that we need, we can assign to it using an initialization. And what that'll do is if we create x in the right spot, well then x will be available throughout our program. And that'll make more sense once we start talking about variable scope, but it's really super important where you declare your variables, because where you declare your variables determines where you can access and see these variables. So later on when we talk about like if statements, if you define a variable int x inside of here, where are these curly braces right here? Well, now we're going to get an error because x is not defined outside of these curly braces. So you might be in a situation where, hey, you know you're going to need the variable x inside of all these different scopes, so we might declare that variable outside, and then inside we can assign to the variable. And that means we could go down here and we could still reference the variable x. So in here it's assigned the value 5, and then we reassign it a value 10. So that wouldn't be possible if we defined the variable inside of here. So if we did it like that, well, now this is going to be an issue because x isn't defined out here once again. So all of the rules on where to define variables, that'll be cleared up once we talk about blocks and variable scope. But for now, just know that sometimes it's important to declare the variable as a separate statement than initializing the variable. And here's another thing. If you declare a variable on one line and then assign it a value, this is known as the initialization. But what we can actually do is we can actually reassign values to this variable. So like I showed in the previous example, we can say x equals 10. So when we do this, we're not creating a new x, it's always referring to the same variable x. And this simple thing is important because once we get into some more complex operators and stuff, there's things we can do with the variable x that will basically reassign values to x or change the values of x. Basically what I'm trying to say is that x can be changed. It's not constricted to just storing one value and never changing. That's because it's a variable, huh? You see what I'm saying? Variable, because it changes, you know what I'm saying? Okay, the other thing you can do is a constant. Now if you want to make a constant, you can prefix the declaration with the keyword final. So we can say final int, and then just by convention, you can name it just like any other variable, but by convention when we create a constant we use capital letters. So we could say final int y equals 5. And now if we go down here and say y equals 10, we should get an error. And it says y cannot be assigned, obviously, because it's a constant. So this can come in handy if you want to create a value that you know is never going to change, like pi, for example. So you could go in here and create a variable pi, and you can go in here and give it a value like 3.14159. And this will actually not be an integer because you can't have anything with a decimal point. So if you wanted to do that, you could change this to double or float. We'll get into those data types soon. And then we can just get rid of this line here. Now sometimes you'll see variables like this created outside of this main method, like this. And you'll also see some differences. You might see public static final, for example. And basically, we're just creating a global variable, which, by the way, I'm not saying this is recommended. I'm just saying it's possible, and you'll often see this. We're just creating a global variable pi that has a value that can be used throughout the program. Static, once again, means we don't have to create an instance of this class. Then if you wanted to use this variable pi inside of here, you could just use it like that. But if you're actually inside of a different class later on, you could say mysweetprogram.py, and that'll give you the value 3.14159. And obviously this is giving an error right now because we're not doing anything with it, but just to show you that it works, you could assign it to another variable like so. So now the error goes away. And the reason inside of another class you could do this is because it's labeled public, which means any class can access this member pi. All right, so now I briefly mentioned whether or not this was a good practice. My rules that I generally try to follow for myself is that if I'm going to have a global variable, I'll try to make that thing final, so that way it's not getting changed throughout different areas of my program. So I try to keep things final, meaning that the value can't be changed just for things like pi that aren't going to change. Or what I'll do is I'll actually make this private, and then I can make what's known as a getter and setter for this variable to basically restrict how this value can be changed. So to summarize, you can declare a variable and you can initialize a variable.